Welcome back to the Venture Podcast. Today, James and I are joined by Akshay, the founder of Saphira AI. We're super excited to talk to him today. They're in the summer Y Combinator 2024 batch. Thank you for joining us, Akshay.
Thank you guys so much for having me. Super excited.
Awesome. So a question that we ask everyone, Akshay, when we get started is, what were you like as a child?
Totally. Okay, I'll start with one of the defining pieces of me as a kid, which was the fact that I had some pretty hefty speech impediments when I was really young. Nothing crazy, but I couldn't pronounce the letter R. And that was particularly challenging because the other piece that defined me as a kid was that I loved cars. I loved cars and I couldn't say the word car. But that love for cars was really what motivated everything else that I cared about. It was what motivated me to be excited about science and technology as a kid. It's what motivated me to make the friends that I made and get excited about the stuff that I was excited about, and really brought me to where I am today. So those are probably the two key things that define me as a kid. I don't know if that's the direction you want to go.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Those are the biggest things.
And off camera a little earlier, you mentioned that you spent the last couple of years you were in Seattle or New York previously, but then before that, Seattle?
Yes.
And did you grow up in Seattle as well?
Did grow up in Seattle. Seattle's
Awesome.
an incredible place. Love the outdoors. That was the other piece that defined so much of my childhood and me today. And it's really a combination of all these things that brought us here.
Yeah. I know Seattle, well, obviously that's like, the headquarters of Microsoft. I believe Amazon's there too.
Exactly.
So what kind of influence did, that environment with those big tech companies being there have on you and your passion for tech at a young age? Or did it have an influence?
A ton.
Yeah.
So I had a bit of an interesting experience growing up in that most of our friends in Bothell, the town that I grew up in, all around there, their parents worked at Microsoft and Amazon and so on. My family did not. My parents were in tech, but they did their own thing, and they took a different route. And so, in contrast to many other people, one of the things that meant was I knew very little beyond the products about these places as companies until I grew up, and that in my mind was actually a really positive thing for the way that I went into the experience of becoming a computer scientist, becoming an engineer, because I did not start with the sense of, hey, this is the direction I'm going with my career, and I know what that looks like.
Yeah.
I very much went, by the time I was old enough to start thinking about a career, decide what I was going to do in college, I chose to study computer science and math because that was the way that I thought I would best understand how the world worked and how the things that I found most interesting worked, and that was the biggest motivator. I would say the biggest influence aside from that, which I guess is the anti-influence, that Microsoft especially had on my life as a kid was the middle and high school that I went to, Eastside Prep, was a school founded by a number of early Microsoft people. And so they were extremely tech forward. From the first day in middle school, we had laptops at a time when, and now this is quite standard, but at the time it was not. And so there was a drive to be deeply familiar with technology from an early age.
Yeah.
And obviously that did not directly itself result in me becoming an engineer, but it was a lot of what drove my interest in the space and what got me rolling, got me moving in this direction.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So take us to, you're at Washington, that's where you did your undergrad. You're studying CS, right?
Yes.
And what were you kind of influenced by? What were you thinking about while you were there? I'm sure all those big companies, maybe you wanted to go work for them, or were you thinking startup entrepreneurship at that point in time?
Here and there. So the story again winds a little bit. The experience that I had going into college was that my high school experience was very much focused on entrepreneurship. I cared a lot about doing different things. I cared a lot about experimenting, trying to build organizations, trying to build products. I spent my last couple of years of high school building a nonprofit focused on financial education, personal finance education. And that was it was the first ever public programming project that I produced. It was the first time I pitched in front of investors and grant writers. It was the first time that I met exactly the kind of people that we continue to work with today, many of my mentors to this day.
Yeah.
And so going into college, there was a bit of this entrepreneurial tinge, but UW is not an entrepreneurial place.
Yeah.
UW is very much, the computer science program especially, if not the best program in the world to train Microsoft and Amazon engineers. So from day one, that was kind of the angle. It's like, hey, you're coming in with these interests, but actually the reason you're here is something else totally. So there were those two kind of conflicting directions for where I should be going. And as a result, I spent all my time thinking about both. I spent a lot of time thinking about the fact that, hey, if you want to be a good engineer at an Amazon or Microsoft, you need to know your stuff. You need to dive deep. You need to deeply understand the academic approach that you take, and you need to be very robust with the way that you engineer your products. For sure. Very different from the way that you approach building a startup to some degree. And on the other side, you still want to care about cool stuff out in the world. And if the first piece was what drove my academic interests, the second piece was what drove everything else that I did at the time, which was much more of the way that we got here. Awesome. The first thing I did when I got to UW was join the Hyperloop team, and that was what got me exposed to systems engineering. It's what got me building physical systems. It's what got me my internship at Tesla, and ultimately it's what introduced me to all the friends that we continue to work with, and indirectly through a number of other things that I was engaged with is what introduced me to my co-founder now as well, and
wow,
super important part of my life.
That's awesome. I'd love to, you mentioned your internship at Tesla. I'd love to jump into that internship, some of the key lessons you learned there.
Totally. Yeah. Okay, key lessons at Tesla. So I will start by talking about something about the culture of Tesla that I think is really interesting.
Okay.
And then maybe talk a little bit about the work and the learnings from that.
Awesome.
So the most important piece of Tesla's culture, that's something I think about a lot when I think about the culture that I want to inspire in the company that I build, is that it's one of the few places you go where people are extremely passionate, not just about what they are building, but just about the principle of building. I experienced this that first summer there. It was really the first full-time job I ever had, where every single person on my team, I was on a reliability testing team, so I was the only software engineer on this entire floor around mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, brilliant people, all of whom would spend all day, 80 hours a week doing crazy test engineering at the headquarters, and then would go home and spend their weekends building all kinds of cool programming projects. Yes. And so, you had this enormous flywheel of people that did really interesting work and still cared so much about just building. And I've never found that again in any other organization I've worked in, small startups, large companies, and I really want to figure out how to continue inspiring that. So that's one of the things that I think about the most when it comes to the experience from Tesla.
Awesome.
The flip side, so I don't know the right way to tell the story, but I didn't know shit when I was working at Tesla. It was a very challenging experience because I came into this full stack engineering role knowing relatively little about actually building products and having very little guidance because there was not a software team around this product. It was built by a series of interns. And that was, in my opinion, an enormous driver of just building independence in engineering. That the fact that I didn't have anyone that I could go to ask questions for the most part was a huge part of the skill that I've tried to build throughout my career of just being able to figure things out. That was the biggest piece of learning that I have from that experience. I think that's something that, as a manager in my previous roles, I've tried to teach, and that we value enormously as a company. Just like figure shit out.
Yeah. I know as well at UW, you did or University of Washington, you did a lot of work in ML, some research there, and then at Facebook you worked on ONNX. I used that a few months back, and I think it's just really cool because this is I guess pre-ChatGPT era AI, and I'd love for you to talk a bit about your experience both at the research level, but also in big tech actually implementing these things. Were there any key learnings there? Any challenges? We'll start with that we'll start with that for now.
Cool. Okay. So I'll answer this from a couple angles, and I'll put a couple caveats in there too. That I have some experience with machine learning engineering, but I never really worked professionally as an ML engineer. I've worked in a bunch of infrastructure around this, like Onyx, the work that I did at Apple after I graduated, and my research also, which was not super deep. I never published anything, but the projects that I was involved with were more on the programming languages side of traditional AI development.
Got it.
Also not directly serving all the stuff that became, especially the areas of machine learning that deeply drove what's happening today. So I'll start by saying that when I came into college, it was very clear from the beginning that machine learning as a discipline was the most important area of development for everyone working in the space. So it was clear that was what we needed to focus on learning. It was clear that if I was going to work on the edge of interesting technology that was highly valuable, that was the stuff to get deeply involved with. And we were right at the beginning of this whole experience of ML engineering kind of becoming quote unquote professionalized. Okay. So one of the whole challenges in the space is that at the time, if you wanted to work in ML, you basically effectively needed to be a PhD level researcher, deeply familiar with the foundations, the mathematical foundations for most of what was going on. And there were certainly many of my peers at UW that managed to do that as undergrads. I did not. It's somewhere between I wasn't smart enough to do that versus I just didn't get the right experience. It was really hard to get there. So one of the biggest things I've appreciated is just how much the ramp up to being having impact building ML-driven solutions has come down to something that any engineer can produce. And I think that was something that
why is that? Would you say?
I think it's because so many solutions today are based on shared foundations. So this whole premise of foundation models that you can use zero-shot methods for everything from image to text classification, any kind of generation. You can start prototyping on the right ways to build just solutions. You still need the same principles for doing the rest of the science that goes into building good products, but a lot of that can come later. So this is a lot of what we're experiencing at Saphira right now as well, that we're able to get something out the door, but actually making it robust requires doing the same science that took us a long time to learn how to do, which is building eval sets and metrics, building the right insights that you use to direct your research, and make the product work properly for your customers. But fortunately, we're able to do so from a place of already having something that does something, which it was much harder to get to that place with any of the kind of work we were doing before. Again, no clue if I'm really answering the question of where we were going, but that kind of tells my experience of where we started in terms of understanding the domain of ML, and how that kind of circuitously wound its way to the way we work today, which is
very cool,
very different.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, I just want to keep it going in terms of, so you did your internships, you did one at, you said Facebook, or first came, which one came?
Tesla,
and Facebook. And then your first full-time role was at Apple, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So,
and a big piece in there, there were a couple startups that I interned at in between.
Cool.
Excellent, tiny Seattle company at the time that's doing incredibly well now out in New York called Samaritan, where I spent part of my time part-time in my freshman year. And then a fantastic startup that was actually based a block away here in San Francisco called Doppler Labs. Long gone, but incredible machine learning group. Learned so much from that team and continue to be friends with many of the folks from there.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and those are like three of the most, like for most people, they work like their whole career to work at like at least one of these like very coveted
Super fortunate for that.
technical tech places to work at. So I'm just curious, like after experiencing all three, like did that give you an idea that startup landscape was something you wanted to dive into? I also want to ask you about Apple though. I don't want to jump past that because that was your first full-time role, which is a little bit different than the internship, 4 months. So
definitely,
if you want to touch on maybe Apple first,
sure.
There's just a lot to touch on. It's really impressive. Is what it is.
No, appreciate that. I guess there's probably one piece of this story that I think I'll mention first, which is that while I've been really fortunate to have these incredible experiences, a really interesting, unusual property across all of them is that the groups that I've been part of have all been incredibly entrepreneurial. So the Onyx team at Facebook, for example, most of the folks that I work with have now left to start Fireworks AI, and we're entrepreneurial people going into that experience. So there was a lot of that kind of mentality floating around. People were starting these new products. The summer I was there, one of my teammates was implementing the first version of the PyTorch JIT. So truly innovative technologies that have had enormous influence on how the entire industry has progressed. And that wouldn't have happened if they hadn't been, questioning these assumptions, saying like, hey, is this the right thing to be building? How should we be building this? what is the completely wild stuff we could be completely throwing out and starting over with. And so there was a little bit of that. The group that I joined at Apple was also an acquisition a couple years before I joined called Turi. And excellent group, originally spun out from a lab at Carnegie Mellon, that then the professors who ran that lab came to University of Washington. That's how I first heard about them. So also folks that were, building out entrepreneurial products within Apple, these fresh machine learning platforms trying to serve novel problems that, the first massive training initiatives across the company we're encountering. And most of those folks have now gone and started many other companies as well. So was really fortunate that there was kind of this mix of the two things. There was a lot of the process and rigor that went into the large companies that I experienced, but also so much of this just startup energy around that was incredibly motivating and kept that in the back of my head, which it doesn't necessarily say in the back of many people's heads that have these same experiences.
For sure. I'd love to ask a question about actually the contrast as well, because your next full-time role was at Citadel, another hugely coveted company and position there. That the entrepreneurship culture that you described, comparing Apple to a tech company to a more financial institution like Citadel, were there any differences that you've observed between possibly those two teams there for the better or worse for both sides?
Totally, yeah. Tons of differences, mostly just based on what the businesses actually need.
Yes.
We were fortunate at Apple that the work that we were doing was foundational for a whole list of novel initiatives. So building data set management tools within the ML platform was critical for everything that's launched since then out of Siri. So many different features that have enabled the Vision Pro. And so there was draw with uncertainty, which is important. And that's very different from the way that an organization like Citadel functions. Citadel is a much smaller company that has basically one objective. They're a trading firm. They have some client-facing responsibilities and businesses, but in the end, everything comes down to one action. And the technology that supports that has kind of done the same few things for a very long time. The infrastructure changes from underneath it, and you face all kinds of different constraints and requirements, but the underlying motivation is still always the same. So this is one of the reasons that even just implicitly, there was much more of that entrepreneurial mindset within organizations like the ones I was part of at Apple, because there was a forcing function to be innovative as a principle, because the products you were trying to enable had not been built before. Very different from the state of things at Citadel, which incredible place to work. Learned so much from everyone that I worked with there, but a lot of that learning was in the scope of implementing things that have been well understood for a long time and making them work better for new outcomes.
In industries that do have the objectives that are well defined and that perhaps don't change over time, how do you still foster a culture of entrepreneurship or a culture of innovation, even though typically it's a very linear solution?
That is a really good question, and I guess I'll start by not answering that question, but kind of adding on to that direction from the last question, which is that I think to reason about an enterprise software company, you need to be able to understand both of these incentive structures well. Because the truth is that even though Citadel is a very established organization that has a few things that it needs to do, and it's always going to need to continue doing and always going to need to continue improving, it is an organization that's still open to change. Citadel is a very early adopter of so many of these Gen AI tools that enable engineers who were, have opportunities to use so many such tools that Ken speaks about that fact that there was openness was super critical. I think this is one of the biggest learnings that I continue to apply when I reason about startups, that you can be entrepreneurial in certain ways with the process that you take, and even then it can be very hard to be entrepreneurial with the foundations of your business. So, for example, the way that this would play out at Citadel is that to maintain an entrepreneurial culture, you introduce a ton of variants to how people work, hence productivity tools, hence tons of investment in SCLC, continuing evolution on that front, and not so much change in terms of the foundations of the actual operations of the company. And as a result, the work that we would do in kind of an operationally supporting engineering role would be thinking about how to improve those underlying technologies to serve new requirements, but not necessarily gut them and start over.
Yes.
Much more of this kind of fixing or like upgrading flying plane as it flies.
Yeah.
I don't know if that really answers your question, but I guess separating those concerns was a huge part of being entrepreneurial in that kind of organization.
Awesome.
Cool. I really want to ask you about how you went about making your decision you had internships, you probably had the opportunity to maybe return to these companies or go to new ones. You were at Apple, and then you obviously had to make the decision to jump to Apple or to Citadel.
Okay, no.
What was the decision making behind that, and what advice would you offer to people early on in their career when making those types of transitions?
I think we were briefly talking about this earlier, where one of the key advice messages that I want to get across that this is something that took me some time to come to, but I share it with everyone I can these days. The most important thing you can do is go where your excitement leads you. It's one of the biggest experiences I've had throughout each of my career experiences, that there was a fair amount of draw based on just foundational interest. And that foundational interest meant that I went into those experiences just excited for what I was going to learn. And that motivation is most of what took me in each of these different directions. Joined Apple instead of going back to Facebook because this group at Apple was incredibly innovative on interpretability. They were incredibly innovative in visualization. And these were spaces that I knew very little about and was really excited to have exposure to. I ended up working in a totally different space, and initially had no idea what to expect when it came to working on scalable data platforms, but learned so much from that experience. That continues to be a huge motivator for what I love doing.
Akshay met his co-founder Oscar at Washington, correct?
Yes.
You guys were friends there. And from what I gather, he was more on the business side. I think he started his career in like banking and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it seemed like he pivoted right into tech. And I'm sure you had a bit of an influence on that.
Tiny bit.
So I'm curious, can you just give me that story and how that pivot kind of worked, and how did you learn to code after at that point in your career?
100%. Cool. Okay, I'll start by telling the story of how Oscar and I met, which we've been telling lots of people, and it's fun. So he used to run the Finance Association, and I used to run the Financial Engineering Club, that later became the Algorithmic Trading Club. And he was really interested in algo trading. I was interested in banking stuff, and so one day I ended up at one of his meetings, and I had business cards when I was in college. Really, really corny business cards that said "Student and Explorer" or something like that. Akshay Chalana, and they had my email address. My email address is this weird sequence of letters that my mom came up with when I was 8 years old because I liked cars. It is AC2Zoom because I like cars, so I like Zoom and my initials. And so I've always used that as my email, and I dropped this business card that said Akshay Chalana, Student Explorer, AC2Zoom, on the floor at Oscar's. No, actually, better yet, I've given it to one of his officers, and his officer promptly just threw it on the floor, just no desire to meet this guy. And Oscar found my business card and said, "This email address looks like it belongs to a VC. It must be someone from Andreessen." It's A16Z, AC2Zoom. And so he emailed me saying, "Yo, I got your business card. You must be a VC. I'd love to talk." And I respond saying, "I'm awfully disappointed to disappoint you. I feel really bad. I'm just another student." And he's like, "Well, you can at least compensate me for my time by letting me come and speak to your club," or something like that. And that was the start of our friendship. And we've been working on a ton of projects since.
That's awesome.
Great guy. So he was deep in this stuff, but he was a really interesting guy because aside from studying finance, he was also in this really cool program at UW called informatics. So maybe you guys had a program like this at your university as well. But computer science is kind of this deep academic discipline, mostly focused on the deep practice of software engineering and the like theory of computer science. And informatics is kind of like applied computer science. It's kind of like the distinction between math and applied math. That it's a program where you actually learn how to build software, like real software in the world, like web apps and mobile apps and stuff like this. So he actually had a fair amount of programming experience, and that was why he was interested in algorithmic trading as well. But mostly from this perspective of like building cool stuff. So when he went through the whole banking experience, he had that whole story of going through a really intense experience doing that kind of work, stuff that he really liked, that he learned a ton from, but he reflected a bunch on it and said, okay, I am much happier when I'm putting stuff out into the world, when I'm building stuff, and that's what redirected him. He ended up spending time interning soon after his banking time at a YC company, and that was what got him on that career trajectory. He did that, got a job at Twitter, ended up leaving to join Amazon a couple of years ago, and that was kind of what brought our path back together. His team at Amazon was a fulfillment center automation team, so he got a bunch of experience with hardware virtualization, which is a big part of what we do now. So we've been best friends for a long time. Our main interests have been finance, shared interest, which is something we both had our experiences with and were ready to move on from. And finally had this rejoining point of, I wanted to get back into hardware. He'd been in hardware for a little while, kind of an accident, and it was the perfect time to work together again.
Awesome. I think, it's an awesome story. I think now would be an awesome time to transition to Saphira AI. Your current company, Y Combinator Summer 24. Can you give our audience a brief overview of Saphira AI, and then we'll go from there.
100%. So Saphira AI has taken a few incarnations, but its current incarnation is what we call Vanta for hardware. So the easiest way to safety certify hardware products. We focus on safety critical hardware per se, so things where the customers will mandate some kind of safety compliance. Industrials, that means your SIL 2 mark with electronics that plug into the grid in your home or even in industrial settings. That means your UL in the US or your CE mark in Europe, and everything else that goes into that, EMC testing, FCC certs, everything else that contributes to safety. So we think about applying AI to automating as much of that process as possible, and I found a ton of similarities between how that gets done when it comes to robots, when it comes to planes, when it comes to cars, and everything in between.
The last question was about Saphira AI. How did the idea come to be?
Totally. All right. So we've taken a bit of a circuitous route, but the way we got started was that I knew I wanted to get back into hardware manufacturing, real life stuff. And so I spent a bit of time exploring ideas in manufacturing. Spent a bunch of time learning about manufacturing execution systems, ERP systems. Really, really hard space to build in. And along the way, ended up at a party here in San Francisco where we met some folks that were building requirements management tools. I'd never heard of any of these tools, never heard of this domain of software. And it was really interesting because it tackled a problem that I had experienced myself. When we were building Hyperloop, one of the biggest problems that we had was that we had a bunch of requirements we had to fulfill that were hard to trace. Things like, for example, I was working on controls. We had to worry about what our motor controller would do in a vacuum. Something that we were buying motor controllers from tractors. Tractors never operate in vacuums. So you have no idea what's going to happen unless you properly model this out. You reason about the hierarchy of effects. You say, okay, like if this is a scenario that occurs, what is the failure case? What is that going to cause for my software? What do I have to account for in my software if I do that? What do I have to account for in the circuits that I developed to relay from the motor controller out to my actual machinery? And so we'd experienced in a very real way why this was a problem, why you need to worry about this, because we didn't build a Hyperloop, and as a result, we crashed multiple pods, things that I was responsible for, things that I still feel terrible about, and knew that if I had better modeling tools that I was using along the way, I would have prevented. So I had no idea this was a domain of software. It was a domain of software that I realized immediately was, oh wow, I should have been using this. And bit by bit, I learned that requirements management as a space was a fairly large space, $5 billion industry relatively, but there were real drivers that actually drove people to adopt those kinds of tools. So we spent a bunch of time trying to build in the space, learn about what people were doing, learn from the users, And that was tough because it was hard to get people to actually use our software, especially in real life. But when we finally managed to, we learned that there was the real underlying driver was that they were seeking their certifications. And we realized when we dug into that there were specific things we could do along the way that were different from what other people building systems engineering tools were doing. And that's what drove us in this direction. We built some stuff, we got out in the world, we realized what was a real reason people were actually adopting it, and that reason was this thing. So circuitous, like, it was unfortunate. We didn't know what we were doing out the gate. We still don't 100% know what we're doing, but we're learning every day. And my priority running the company is that the best people to learn from are my customers, and people who will pay or will use my software. And those are the people I want to be around, providing them as much value as possible.
Awesome. Something that we've noticed actually in a couple of our past interviews this week, in conversations even off camera, there's such a strong emphasis on PMFs. Some people define it in different ways, but it seems like that was something that was super important to you guys as well. I'd love to hear a little bit more. Let's double click on that journey, trying to find PMF for you guys. You mentioned, eventually how you believe that now you found it, but I'd love to understand that process and how you, came to kind of focus on this certification piece, and perhaps what you're still doing to, even if you don't believe you've completely found it, what we're still doing right now.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely far from PMF. I think there's a quote from one of the YC partners that if you have to ask yourself whether you have PMF, you don't have PMF. So the fact that I'm able to consider the question means I'm definitely far from it. But this journey that we're on is kind of that journey I was explaining towards the end of the last answer. That we started by building software that we found interesting, that tackled a problem we were familiar with for customers that we knew that people would use, but there wasn't a drive to adopt. And that has been what we have been searching for. And in that search, we have finally started hitting up against the fun parts of the company, which are, for example, that we've dug deep enough that we have a pretty narrow definition of one of the problems we're trying to solve in the certification journey, and the technology that we have is not quite there yet. So we're finally at a place where we're hitting this cycle of we're defining a problem that we know people care about, and we're even able to get them to pay for it, but we need to catch up now. We need to actually deliver the technology, and that's the cycle that we're in now. So that's a cycle that everyone goes through. It's that the ideal case is that you build something, you get some feedback, you figure out what the core value is, you sell that for more than it's worth, and you get ahead of yourself, and you have to catch up, and you make everything into execution risk. I think one of Oscar's friends had given us that advice very early on. The best thing you can do is turn any problem that you have as a company into an execution risk, which is that's something you can deal with. If you failed at doing something, at least you know that you failed and you can do it better next time.
Yes.
If there's uncertainty on any other vector, say your market, the feasibility of the technology itself, much harder things to solve for.
Yeah. Actually, we only have about 6 minutes left, so we'll try and rapid fire a couple of questions at you. But before that, I wanted to really ask you, being a part of the YC summer batch, working with guys like Michael Seibel, Gary Tran, I think you guys have even heard from Sam Altman, some really cool pioneers in the industry. What is the best piece of advice you've received this summer?
100%. Okay, so there are two things that I think YC is really good at encouraging. And this is what we learn from our direct partners, Jared and John, and it's what we learn even more importantly from the rest of our cohort. Those two things are, one, that you should always be searching for the truth, right? The statement of what is actually going to work. And you shouldn't be fixed onto things that are not working. I think the behavior that comes too easily to us as engineers is I have built something, I have sunk cost, I want to really, really, really see that through. When in reality, basic things like changing your messaging, changing your target, changing the scope of what you're doing can work wonders for how people value your business. And so that kind of openness has been something we kind of expected to find within YC. And the community has really, and especially our partners' advice, has really driven us to actually do that. Hence, this narrowing focus on certification as a core problem, and trying to find something that is opportunity for us to do something cool and show that it's possible, and work really hard at that. The second thing is, where I want to go with this, just the fact that you want to be out in the world as much as possible. So YC's number one statement is the statement that you should launch, and launch early and launch often.
No one remembers anyone's launch.
Exactly. It's what they tell us every day. And I think there are the pieces of that make a lot of sense, and there are pieces of that are hard and that we're still struggling to learn.
Yeah.
So part of it that makes sense is, YC's main value is getting you in front of investors, and launching through the YC platform is enormous for getting in front of investors. So that was something that we didn't realize quite how important that was early on, and as soon as we did it, it became very clear how important that was.
Yeah.
The second piece is the fact that you very clearly see that the people in the batch that do this right get a ton of exposure to the right customers as well by having the right kind of launches in the right forums. There are some folks in our batch that have done an incredible job with this. Some of the key companies that you guys may have seen, and will hopefully continue to be the most iconic ones from the batch, like Bucket Robotics and Wordware, have had enormous traction from their launches.
That's
They've gotten in front of millions of users. They've gotten in front of enormous decision makers at F100 companies.
That's awesome.
All this kind of stuff. So our launches have not had that result, and that has been enormous encouragement to keep on trying. To keep on, getting in front of the right communities, tuning the messaging to show value, and exactly as you said, no one's going to remember the things that didn't work. The things that did work are going to be the launching points for your company, and we still got to figure that out.
Bucket Robotics, actually, that's Mike Pachalski.
Matt
Pachalski.
Matt is one of the kindest guys in the batch.
He's so nice. I actually met him. It was this is so funny. This was a few years back. It was a tour at the Columbia Graduate School of Business, and I met him there. And he was at the time he was contemplating doing like a postgrad degree in that Columbia, I guess, the graduate school. I was a little early at the time, but I was looking as well. But no, I remember because I when we were doing the tour, I walked beside him. He's an awesome guy.
Super cool.
So yeah, I've been seeing. If you do watch this, man, I've been seeing what you've been doing on YC. It looks pretty cool.
Love it.
Yeah, it's really
dude,
cool.
Matt is. That is awesome. What a story of having met the guy.
Yeah. It's really cool. And now we're, I guess, both in the entrepreneurial space, right?
Exactly.
Everything happens for a reason. It's
all
really
the
cool.
same ecosystem, and exactly. your background in safety systems, exactly the kind of stuff that he's thinking about from the integration perspective.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hardware manufacturing.
Yeah. Are there, I guess, rapid fire questions?
I'm trying to think. What kind of final questions? I guess one thing we kind of ask is, we get a lot of listeners who are still in school, people who are, just about to graduate, have just graduated, or maybe very early on in their career, and they're interested in startups and they want to get into the space. What advice do you have for them in getting started?
100%. Okay, two things that I think matter a lot. The first thing, which I think I mentioned earlier in the conversation, I've said otherwise, follow what you're excited about. I think it's tried to say follow your passion, but this is something that I've experienced that I love being in the room with people building cool hardware. I'm not a mechanical engineer. I'm not even a computer engineer. I'm a software theory guy through and through. But those are the rooms that I've always enjoyed the most. And so that's one thing I've experienced a lot in the last several months of working on Saphira, that I just feel happier when I get to be around the people that I find most exciting. And whether or not that leads to business, whether that means that I'm even doing the right thing, being happy is worth optimizing for.
That's awesome.
And that's super important. The second thing I would say is figure out as early as possible how you stay in the rooms that you're most excited to be in. So when I reflect on decisions that I made throughout my career so far, there have been some opportunities to have done that better. A big one is, for example, you want to be around entrepreneurial people, work for a startup. In the end, that's probably the best thing you can do. And it shows you very clearly from the other angle what matters and what doesn't matter, because you get to observe the failures of the company that you're working for without having the the burden of being responsible for those decisions. And that's a huge learning opportunity. And the other side too, and this is something I reflect on a lot. I was deeply involved with the startup community at UW, which wasn't a huge community, but most of those folks that continued in that path did incredibly well for themselves, joining very early stage companies, starting companies straight out of school, and many of them have become, just in the last 5 years, incredible leaders in industry.
Wow.
And so I think a big takeaway from seeing all of that is the fact that if you set yourself up to have taken the risks to make it big, even when things don't work out, you get way more out of those experiences.
Wow.
I think that's something that was always in the back of my head, and until I left my last job and started this company, it always felt like something that I wasn't really diving into. And I've had this experience since graduation that there's always been the bit of me in the back of my head that's been why am I not taking a bigger risk? And I would always ask myself that, and it would be a motivation to try doing side projects or try getting involved with other stuff outside of work. And that was never enough. It never really felt like I had this opportunity to put 100% of myself towards some outcome that could be massive or could fail miserably. And so feeling like you're doing that, if that's what you want to do, is incredibly important. I think, funnily enough, if your audience is primarily college students, I think actually the experience of being in college is all that. It's your entire life, your entire personality, your entire being is tied up with being in class and learning things well, and the first jobs that you get, and it's really easy to lose that. So I think startup life has restored a lot of that feeling, and I felt like I'm back in college, but I've had the technical expertise to do stuff that I find really interesting, and the whole combination of things has just been really exciting.
That's awesome. I do have one more question I do want to ask before. Yesterday, we interviewed the co-founder of NPM, Node Package Manager, and something that he talked about in relation to AI is the purpose of life, in his opinion, being to thrive. And he didn't mean it from a monetary sense or anything like that. He more so meant, to do great things, to build great things as a humanity. And I think a huge, as you mentioned earlier, a huge opportunity in the industry will definitely be with robotics. And there's a lot of questions with safety. So how do you think Saphira will contribute to a future where we have a thriving world in terms of robotics, and with human robotic, humans and robots coexisting in a safe way? How do you think Saphira might even play into that?
Awesome. This brings things back to reality. I was saying earlier that I felt like a lot of our conversation is very meta. This is the kind of conversation that we have all day, and this is the kind of thing I can really speak to. So when it comes to robotics today, there are two things that I think are important to think about. One is that autonomy is really hard to control. Autonomy is critical to the kind of functionality that people want to deliver, and it is not super well understood in most scenarios. So the result, we spend so much time talking about this with our customers, with others in the community, that you want to have autonomous systems in tightly controlled environments. You have to really gate them off. So there's really no such thing today as a safe autonomous system that properly commingles with humans. Autonomous vehicles on the road are probably the closest we actually get to that. And it's really impressive what organizations like Waymo have done on that front. So I think there are a couple big things that we seek to enable through Saphira that hopefully make that story a little bit clearer. One piece of that is in the automotive world, there's this whole primitive of SOTIF that has emerged with the development of autonomous systems, safety of the attendant function, where you're able to define ODDs, your domain that you operate in, and you're able to analyze safety conditions within a well-defined restricted domain. I think everyone that is thinking about safety of robotics is trying to define those ODDs more clearly, and as they do so, is going to be able to analyze all kinds of outcomes from their autonomous systems much more easily. We want to make it really easy to get to that point. So part of that is going to be a story of understanding what's happening in simulation really well. Part of that is going to be a story of just like more clearly defining the actual intended functions that you expect to perform. The primitives, like how that's going to apply to like robots of different forms is pretty ambiguous right now. And part of that story, the second piece of what I was going to mention is that there really aren't standards being, I mean, they're being written, but there aren't standards that have been publicly disclosed for humanoids or even autonomous industrial systems at this point. And we want to be a big part of setting the standard, if nothing else, from helping people figure out the way to actually get there. So we spend so much time, for example, having conversations with robotics companies where we get asked, I understand with, say, a safety PLC how I make this particular controller safe, but what if I had like other inputs? What if I had like a vision input? There are people that like build the components that make that possible. We're only the experts that like help you figure that out, that help you figure out what the cheapest way to do that is, what the most cost-effective way to do that is, and what the right way to do these things are. So we're at the very beginning of the story, but the whole point that we're trying to make with all this is we strongly believe that in the coming months we are going to be the experts for reasoning about how to make ambiguous autonomous systems safe. And right now, we just want to be having as many conversations as possible to answer those questions. And
awesome.
we have a ton of insight to share. We have a ton of experts to point everyone towards in the community. And we expect that we're going to be big players in just making sure that this stuff actually happens.
That's awesome.
So yeah, also if you're interested in contacting Akshay,
Yes.
I mean, I think he's very open to that. Where can they contact you?
Super easy to find on LinkedIn, Akshay Chalana. You can find me on Twitter, AC to Zoom. AC to Zoom is what I go by just about everywhere, so feel free to shoot me an email, whatever it might be. Akshay at Saphira AI, any of these platforms. Always happy to talk.
So, any last words for our audience? Anything that you haven't talked about today that you think is really important for them to know?
Let's see.
Yeah.
The one piece that we kind of alluded to earlier, huge part of the life that I have built is like having family that is incredibly aspirational. So maybe we'll drag her out, but my fiance is also a YC founder. She's kind of the inspiration for a lot of what we're doing. And having a support system like her is just unbelievably important. So family matters a lot. Focus on that.
Yeah.
And off camera, Akshay actually told us they're getting married this weekend. So the fact that, first applause to that, and the fact that you're having people in your home that have a podcast with you this close to a wedding is mind-boggling and a testament to you. So thanks a lot, Akshay.
And I appreciate you guys coming in. You caught me in the 20 hours I'm back in San Francisco, so the timing worked out perfectly. Very, very happy.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to be Akshay.
Thanks, Akshay.